the mental pressure of not having leadership and any kind of true point of sense of like, what is the deal? What is happening? Was extremely disorienting. And I remember at one point after, and at the beginning, I think we all everywhere kind of took the lockdown quite seriously, like weren't leaving the home and everything. So I remember at one point going out to this pharmacy when pharmacies opened or something like that. And I remember this was in like probably, let's say, in the early April or something. And I remember having a feeling that I remember understanding how limited my perception was to the news/social media bubble that I was in. Like in a way, I remember just distinctly feeling how much I missed. How in New York you get your pulse through the city. When you walk down the street, you take the subway, you get a sense of what's happening. You walk through Washington Square Park, you see, like, you feel things in the air. And I realized when I went to the pharmacy that hadn't happened in a long time, and really all the information that I was acting to was coming through some form of a screen or people you talk to. That's one. And two, I also realized then, I didn't think at the time that the city was going to hold for long, because you realize then the streets were empty, but you also see homelessness and people, which, how can you talk to people about wearing masks or a pandemic when they don't have the most basic kind of forms of life. So, but all of this to say that I did for sure get a distinct appreciation of what a city has to offer, but also how much we need one another, no matter how much of an introvert you are, or it's not about how social one is, but how quintessential, how interdependent we are as human beings. And that was a nice realization. And I think, I hope that that's in a way the lesson. Like, I hope that I hope that many people experience that sense of when you see a crowd, or when you watch a movie with a party, or when you
it's a surreal experience.
Yeah, and I do hope there is a sense of appreciation in a way for people, for the social life of city, and for urbanity, and for not taking those things for granted, whether it's forms of collective community or just strangers. I do remember that too, at one point, running through Central Park, and this old lady stopped me to take a picture of her running. She was fairly old, she couldn't run, but it was she wanted me to take it because it was when Ahmaud Arbery, his killing had just kind of made the news, and there was this kind of, which also seems insane because so much happened since. But when there was, everyone was trying to to honor him, to take a photo of themselves running in the park. And so she asked me to take a picture of her, kind of pretend running, which was really sweet. And I realized too that, and of course you do it at the time with fear, and she was older, and she's like, and gloves and everything. But there was something so sweet in the moment. I realized one of the things I miss most, it was strangers in New York, and kind of random little silly conversations, whether it's encounters with someone like that, or jokes that are being thrown your way, or just overhearing things on the street, like that kind of. It's interesting to realize how important those things are, the things that you kind of take for granted or don't spend thinking time about.
That's one thing that digital communication doesn't allow, right? The overhearing, the kind of immediacy of just urban everyday life,
and the informality in a way. It's really informal, right? On a screen.
There is often the sense that your work is very much based on exactly what you were just saying, the immediacy of relationships that you've built with people in that kind of urban life. It almost feels like that. I don't know if it is, or I'm misreading, but there is a kind of sense that a lot comes from exactly the thing that we're devoid of right now. So I'm wondering whether that's kind of making you think about those things and reassess those values or relationships.
It's a good question. I think it's a pretty accurate, actually, portrayal of the work, although I would it comes from immediate relationships, but it also comes just out of, I think, that deep personal sort of just, I'm into something random and this might not make sense. Can I turn it into something? You know what I mean? It's the kind of thing where it's like what you think you're supposed to be doing versus the thing that you actually want to be doing. And then you're like, how can I turn this into the thing? Like, how can I turn, this fun thing, this enjoyable thing, or this thing that interests me, whether it's whatever, a bird flying on the sky or whatever random stuff or a line from a book, how can I capitalize on that? Like, how can I dig deeper and understand how that plays into anything? With regards to relationships, I mean, to a certain degree, I think it's true, but I don't necessarily, I can't say I necessarily miss, I certainly miss people and encounters in the last year, but in the same time, I do think that the situation sort of also brings people closer in different ways, right? So I think it it just puts everyone in a more vulnerable position, and automatically it's hard to have small talk because what are you going to talk about, right? So it's, if someone writes how are you, is like, it's one of those things where like you can't respond to that text message, where do you even begin?
Yeah.
But if someone, but instead you have conversations that go directly, in a deeper place, maybe, or sillier place for that matter, like you can go in either extreme. But so I do think but I'm always trying to think of, okay, how can you, to in a certain degree, take advantage of it, or how can you capitalize on a situation, because I think there's something to be learned in any situation. And I do, my standard modus operandi is to hide and to go off in the woods or for weeks on my end, on end by myself, or to kind of, just sit with a good book. So parts of the pandemic certainly felt quite comfortable or natural, but of course there is the isolation. It tastes different when you know that, there's impending doom and everything.
When it's forced, yeah.
Yeah. I do remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I was at my friend's barn, just me and my dog, upstate New York. And I love that place. It's such a nice place, and I've been there before. But this was the first time where it felt kind of creepy, where at night, or where I was like, this is weird, but also because, the news were talking about people buying guns, and there was this just overall kind of energy in the air. And I always find that interesting, how those kind of elements kind of get under your skin, and ultimately, you know what I mean, how energy travels and how that defines the way you're looking at the world around you. But to your point with collaborations and people, I don't know, I think that it opens also possibilities for new things or new ways of connecting in ways in which it wouldn't happen before. I mean, now that I think about it, I realized I started getting, I just got I just realized that a piece I had written 2 years ago on crowds was published last year. They sent it to me to an old address. I never got it. Now I learned that it was published. But so along with that, there were a few other things that, now that I look back at the last year, I was like, well, I guess I'm trying to maybe understand the last year or make a little bit of sense of it, just on a, I don't know if professional level is the right way of putting it. And I do think there is something to be said in terms about how within reach people are. Like, I don't know if you and I would have this conversation if it wouldn't have been for this pandemic, right? And I don't wish the pandemic onto anyone, but I think we also at times are able to communicate more, maybe more imperfect too, and not under ideal situations. But I think you also, in a way, I think I felt in many ways, I don't know if more closer to people, but more out there, or more engaged with people outside of my usual circles during this year.
Maybe more tuned in.
Maybe more tuned in, and maybe it just has to do actually with isolation, and being that when you're so isolated, you also kind of reach out, or you kind of also need that kind of conversation, because it's the only conversations you have, right? So it's more like, called it choreographed serendipity, choreographed accidents. So there is, I think it's fascinating. I think there is a different facet to it, where maybe we were listening a little bit closer. I think there is something about the fact that everyone was vulnerable this last year. Like, no matter who you are, no matter what you go through, there's no way this moment didn't make you think. If this didn't make you think, then nothing will. And that sets a tone. Sorry, go ahead.
I think one way or another, we've all reassessed ourselves to some extent.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether you've reassessed your work through what happened, not just because you had time to sit down and reflect, but also because architecture, built environment, perhaps it has a different value in this new moment.
I mean, I do think the questions on my mind are less, I don't look back all that much. I mean, it happens, of course, when you need to talk about that work and you need to kind of phrase, like, you know what I mean? When you, let's say, just talk about that work, of course, that forces some kind of, let's say, introspection or revisitation. But I'm spending less time in that than kind of just thinking, what's next? How do I go about it? And in a way, I think there's two sides to it. On the one hand, I think I believe stronger in architecture than ever before. And to me, it became like that its purpose, its role, its power has been really crystal clear this year. And so I think in a way, there's a bigger drive and incentive and kind of just desire to just do it. And frankly, it's funny because I think people look at my work in different ways. Like, I don't think much about my work just because I don't draw a distinction, I think, maybe between the work and me, or I don't know if that's the right way of putting it. But what I'm trying to say, I think actually architecture is the one thing that I do best. So in a way, I don't have many big projects yet or things like that, but actually larger scale and buildings are really my comfort zone, and the kind of smaller things and installations, they're way outside of my comfort zone. But the other, so though I think that's the reinforced kind of, not even, I feel I learned so much about architecture in this last year and kind of understand its role and purpose a lot better. And then on the other hand, with regards to my own practice, I think I also gained some distance, some perspective, which was part of the desire with the move to Berlin, and kind of the ability to do less but be more involved, and to kind of pick and choose and kind of be more precious with where I put the time in, and also have some distance and kind of just explore some different territories. So it's funny because on the one hand, the belief in purpose of architecture is like became a lot more acute in a way than it was. On the other hand, I think this year also allowed me to work at different, like in different ways, or to appreciate other facets of architecture, whether it's, or not even through architecture, of me, of whatever I do. So kind of understanding the value of writing something or of talking to people and kind of not knowing where and how it will go, or how it will reach someone, or or just doing things that are more removed from traditional art. So in a way, I was like, well, maybe this is all okay, and maybe I can see maybe this is all okay. I'm saying that because, I'm coming from Eastern Europe, which is very kind of, you need to work for a living and you need to produce and you need to do the work, tangible work. So when I grew up, the idea of being an artist or a writer, that those were not things on the table, right? You need to be a doctor, a lawyer, an economist. Like that's it. Your life depends, your livelihood depends on that. And
architect is kind of acceptable.
Yeah, but it wasn't necessarily on the table. It was kind of like, it kind of showed up. So I think I chose it because it was on the weird one.
It was between. It was kind of okay. It's not artist, but it's not.
Yeah. Like it tells the parents, is like, that's a real thing, but also like, I don't know what architects do.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think kind of, I think I was in a way both encouraged or through the. I think there was something interesting in this last year with dialogue with all sorts of different people and people outside of architecture and everything too, that I kind of learned to appreciate. And, it's still something that I'm not fully comfortable with. I think as an introvert, I always want to go and hide after.
Well, you classify yourself as an introvert.
Oh, that's not even a question. That's
Okay, I love that.
Me
too.
I can have papers for that. That's certified.
Me too.
But I'm saying that because basically I still learned that there's something about these. I learned to really appreciate the just conversations and exchanges of ideas and yeah, just talking to people. And it sounds a bit banal maybe, but I thought it was.
No, I think so. I mean, that was my real realization. I feel that everything is in the conversation, because I think conversation ultimately challenges any form of dogmatism, because, you know, there is always a different voice. It's not ever one voice, which I think is always really important. And it's to talk about the bubbles that you mentioned, like realizing that, you know, actually bubble is not a dialogue. Dialogue is like two bubbles. But you said, I think what's really interesting what you said is that there is a renewed appreciation of architecture. And I'm wondering whether there is a very specific thing that you can point at. Was it just a year of thinking or meditation, or was it an experience of a building? So something that is more tangible?
I mean, I think it's just how everything comes together. In essence, it's primarily, I think, maybe two sides to it. On the one hand, it's just the value of public space, right, and public experiences. And if outside is the only place where you're allowed to, let's say, meet people or just go to escape your four walls. So in a way, it's very direct, just based on the lockdown experience, I think, and of course everything else we're taking in. But on the one hand, you have the urban experience. And when the lockdown started, I was home in Harlem, and so I would just go to Central Park, and I don't think I could have survived New York for the last, I don't know, 5 years or so, was it not for Central Park. And you really learn to appreciate that. And you just understand the value of having a tree in front of your window and having a place to walk in and to have a bench on the street to sit on. And all of a sudden, these things are like pure gold. And it's like you feel it, you know it. And I think pre-pandemic we could know that on paper, but we wouldn't have time to sit on a bench to indulge, to take those things in. And in a way, I think that's what I again, on the optimist in me is wanting to hold on to the fact that we do learn to maybe appreciate the very basic, simple things that life is actually about, and that bring value to life. I think that is the main takeaway in my perspective. It's that it's not about freaking Mars. Like, why? It's really just about making sure these trees can still grow and that we still have fresh air and that we could actually, I remember, because it was spring last year, I remember the birds in New York just going wild, and you would hear them so much. And I always was thinking, it's like, well, the new birds, like the pups, the chicks that just kind of were born, do they think the world is always this quiet? Are they gonna be having a bad surprise when we resume to, like, in a way you could see nature sort of having a good time and enjoying the quietness, and that was just so nice. So on one hand, back to the architecture part, it is about just the urban experience, and like I think in those moments you felt like your life depended on it. And it's not about being able to, right, we were like, oh yeah, we go on vacation somewhere, or yeah, we drive somewhere. No, it has to be within your walking distance, within your, within a radius from where you live. And there was no that, so it became it in a way became almost as important as anything else. As it's part of healthcare in a way. It's part of mental sanity. It's should be part of like a human right in a way. Like, it's not something that should be driven by, let's say, money or developers. It shouldn't be something that's accidental or kind of seen as a luxury. It is, the very essence of urban life. And again, we know all those things, we've learned them, but we're still not, I think, fully appreciating them. On the other hand, it just has to do with how we live and how we use spaces. And funnily enough, I was teaching a studio that was called Post Work. if you forget how many works, it's because of the sing the song.
Rihanna song.
But there's a website, postwork.org, so you can see some of the work there. But we're investigating housing in a post-work society, right? Because that's also something that's actually tangible. So it's funny because halfway through in that semester, then we were all sent home and we were kind of living in a post-work society to a certain degree. And you know, if you spend just like a minimum amount of time looking at the flats that we live in, but also the kind of junk that we constantly build, how out of sync that is with our needs as humans, but also with how society developed and how the kind of multiplicity of forms of humanity that we encounter, and how out of sync they are. So I think most people found their own either bubble or families, chosen families, right? To kind of, we all developed our survival or support system during the pandemic, in whichever way. And whether it's people living together or sharing places or whatever, and so it makes you think, then why do we still build the same shit over and over again, that just leads to, like, in a way I hope the interdependence was kind of shown, the fact that you depend on one another in the most basic terms. You can't go through life not realizing that. And I'm saying that, you know, especially under the light of just a very kind of American life that I was living under in the US. And it I mean, it's just basic stuff. It's like, well, if you just think of, if you were to design, let's say, housing, right, for chosen families instead of nuclear families, or if your basic assumption for housing would be that you could share certain things, or that you are aware of your neighbor, but it's more about not knowing your neighbor, but actually, you know, it being the place where you go ask for sugar or something like that. Like, if you pool your resources, you can have a lot more for your buck too, but also live just a lot nicer and better. I feel altogether there's just so much crap happening because architecture is so driven by developer money, and not the developer being bad, but really just by what's the biggest amount of money I can make, what's the fastest and the cheapest buck I can make. And if you think of that, like, I think that's dangerous for society to be driven by that. And those forms of construction and ultimately, you know, reflect back on us. They limit what and how we can live, and who we live with, and how we think of our places and our lives. And I think that is a problem. And in a way, I think there's a lot more agency there that we can take the reins on. And that go ahead.
Do you think in America you almost are always in service of that kind of approach to production?
Yeah, I mean, America is about the individual, right? And it's about each on their own, and that there's no question about that. And that as a society, that's the way the society is structured. And in a way, if this pandemic wasn't a lesson about the risks or the limitations of that mind frame, then I don't know what will be.
I think it is a very good point that actually in America there isn't really a dialogue about that. It's really pretty much one-sided. I mean, Democrats are trying to relax it a tiny bit, but it's not anywhere close to some kind of centrist approach.
Yeah. Like, without a doubt, at a political level or anything. I mean, you know, what they call socialist is actually really funny.
Yeah, it's really fun. It's not even centrist in
like,
Europe.
Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's kind of funny, kind of sad.
Yeah.
But in the same time, so I do think that is absolutely true at the kind of like a big picture level. And the way I see it is, I feel everyone understands the system is sort of, I don't want to call it rigged, but the system is messed up. But I feel everyone also wants to be the one who makes it. You know what I mean? So nobody wants to fix the system, so we're all kind of in the same place, but rather, I know it's fucked up, but I hope I'm the one who makes it through. You know what I mean? It's still very much about winning and about succeeding.
Benefiting from it.
Yeah, exactly. And ultimately benefiting of it. But I will say, in the same times, you do have I do think there are, because of how extreme that is, and because how extreme the inequality in so many aspects of, how brutal many aspects of American life can be, I think there are also sort of alternative ways that are a lot more, maybe, I don't know if that's right or not, but more experimental, or more, there are different forms of collectivity that happen in reaction to that. And that happen particularly in communities, right, that reject or try to reject that kind of way of thinking. And that happens in communities that have, never had any illusions about the system, and what the system is about, and so on and so forth. So I think there are, in the same time, there are little pockets of, I don't know if freedom to a certain degree, but little pockets of aspiration towards forms of change. When I find Europe tends to be kind of also in denial about,
institutionalized almost.
Yeah, exactly, and kind of in denial about, everything is great, we're doing good. and everyone needs to behave, and there's no appreciation of noise or speaking up, or trying to poke here and there. That's not seen as acceptable. Where I think in the States there is a kind of, there still is that sort of audacious sort of optimism or desire for different futures. When in Europe, I think it's a lot kind of a slower and more incremental, and a lot more, let's hold on to who we are and what we think society is. So it's a lot more rigid in many ways. And I'm saying that because there's pluses and minuses. It's not all good, it's not all bad, of the two cases. And I think that's important because, when you're here, of course, everyone shits on America. When you're American, and everyone shits on Europe. Like it's always
grass is always greener on the other side,
and it's valid for all the other continents too.
Yeah.
So nobody has it down though, and I think that's also something the pandemic has been revealing in many ways, from the way things were handled in the beginning to the vaccine. Right? Like it really kind of, it's a little bit like a family Thanksgiving where all the shit just comes up to surface, right? It's like you can't avoid it. It's like it's kind of obvious, the limitations and the challenges of each of the systems that we're confronted with in any of the continents.
There's something in that American openness that I always found, and there are certain opportunities that are kind of connected to that.
The one book or the one piece of writing that helped me understand the difference or the parallel between Europe and US a lot better. I'll just send it to you so I don't read it. It's Baldwin, and he had one piece that is called What It Means to Be an American. And I mean, he has two sides of it, but on one hand, he says, though American society is more mobile than Europe's, it is easier to cut across social and occupational lines than it is here. This has something to do, I think, with the problem of status in America, where everyone has status. It's also perfectly possible, after all, that no one has. It seems inevitable in any case that a man may become uneasy as to just what his status is. And he goes on to say that in Europe, you've lived with the idea of status for a long time, so you kind of don't have the same kind of issues with it. But then he also goes on to say, Europe has what we do not have yet, a sense of the mysterious and inexorable limits of life, a sense, in a word, of tragedy. And we have what they sorely need, a new sense of life's possibilities. So I think this kind of parallel is I always return to it just because it helped me make sense of it. And he's brutally critical both about Europe and the US. And I think, to answer your question, it's funny because I mean, I lived in many places, I moved so much around. I feel weirdly American now that I'm in Europe, and I feel very European when I'm in the States. Like in a way, or like that I'm seen or perceived as such, not necessarily that I feel that way. But I know that many of the things that I got to do and the conversations that I got to have, for example, in schools, or the things that I got to explore, whether in school or work, I don't know that the same avenues would have been open for me in Europe. It's a little bit hard for me to tell because I'm still new here and I don't have many, let's say, roots here. In the same time, I am doing work in Romania that I couldn't have been doing in the States either. I think the States can be a great place to meet people, to encounter unexpected, to take for. It's a great place where people do take chances and risks and really kind of are aiming to change something or to push things forward. There's a strong desire to do that. I feel here there's a lot more institutionalized reluctance, hierarchy, old ways, and kind of decorum. You have to behave. No, making noise is not being appreciated, and so on and so forth. So, Romania is a Latin country, so I think that's not that easy necessarily to.
It's interesting because I think Romania, because I'm Serbian neighbor. I think in these kind of post-communist societies, actually, there is a funny sense of Americanism and a lack of that kind of elitism that you get in Britain or or maybe Germany. I don't actually know very well, but certainly France is this kind of elitist classes and things. I think that's one thing that maybe communism has erased to a certain. I mean, of course, there was a ruling class in both communisms, but there was a pretty flat structure to the rest of the society. Yeah.
Pretty flat, but I feel the difference is America is not flat. And maybe there was a middle class at one point, or maybe there was a relative flatness to one point. But I know what you mean. Like it's not. But basically, what I'm saying, the U.S. isn't flat either, because I feel in Romania and during communism, there was a bit of a ruling party, but the majority people, like there wasn't, let's make it, or like, being wealthy meant having a new car at most, or maybe taking a vacation. But it wasn't any crucial divide or any separation. It just felt like we're kind of all in it together. So you didn't have any of that. But I don't think that's the case in the US either, where there isn't a desire to, like I think in a communist country, you also depended on one another, right? And you always kind of try to skirt the rules, whether it's about trying finding food or finding, you would always help each other. And you would always depend on one another to kind of go around the rules and find meet or buy this or do that or build something or do something or basically build your life, because the government was kind of extremely what's the word, limiting in what the what the offerings were, right? It was all about the party and nothing else. So I think then we had to kind of invent ways to distract ourselves, to entertain the kids, but to also just build a sense of life in spite of that huge sort of absurdist almost spectacle that was defining your life. Which is not at all the case in the US. Not only is it not flat, but I think it's more of like let's step on top of each other and try to aim for something.
Yeah,
I do think at times I do wonder, it is strange to me when I go, let's say, to Eastern Europe and you see people still building malls and you're like, I do wish that you could learn from other countries or other more developed societies' mistakes. Yeah. But I think that doesn't happen, but the lag still kind of happens where you do want those things because you've seen them on TV and so there is still kind of a thriving towards that.
They're kind of importing the worst.
Yeah, which I think oftentimes is so unfortunate because you're like, okay, we know that didn't go anywhere. We know what the end of that was, right? Yeah. But I do think the one thing that we did not have the luxury to have in Eastern Europe is the illusion about life. It's in a way you have a deep sense of tragedy when you come from a place like that because you experience it and it's part of life, right? Like in a way I feel in Eastern Europe, and I don't know how you feel about it, but I always felt like, even extending it to Russia, there is a sense that there's also not only a sense of acceptance of tragedy, but an understanding that it's a key part of life. That life is hard and that's part of it. Where I think in the US, it's still very much everything is great. It's
Yeah.
still very much that's the official thing. It's all positivism and it's all everything is great. The sun is shining all the time, and but also no illusions. Like again in Eastern Europe, you have no illusions, and especially if you're from where you're coming from, illusions about power and authority and the way power corrupts no matter what, and any of that stuff. I mean, the I think what we sometimes tend to forget, and I was just having these conversations with a friend the other day, is that America is a global power, but it's also extremely provincial in how it acts, and and it doesn't see that.
In relationship to itself as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I was from Western Romania, so when Belgrade was bombed, there were still rumors that that's why a lot of people were having cancer. But basically, that was close. That was close to home. Like you have such a different perspectives on the poker game that any of the global powers are playing. So I think if you go through that, but you also experience, the dictator kind of being overthrown overnight and shot live on TV and like all of that stuff, I don't think you have many illusions about anything, about power, about authority, about any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that is, to me, that is an important sort of grain, or that it is.
I think so.
I'm an optimist and I'm a kind of believer and so on and so forth. But to me, that understanding of life is important, of not deferring to power, to authority, not having that illusion that, everything is great.
Stable. Yeah. Not having the illusion of stability of the system. Yeah. Perhaps one thing that resulted from coronavirus, and it was almost legally imposed on all of us, is to define where the home is. I think I've in some way or another rethought that relationship with what I feel is home, or even kind of rethinking the relationship with my original home. And I think what was really interesting, I was listening to one of your talks where you basically doing a project in your hometown, and there is a sense of returning to a place which you departed from. And I think these notions of departure and arrival and return, and especially return to a childhood home, it's a moment that requires a certain kind of strength and a certain kind of trauma,
Mm-hmm. I feel the traumatic experience, I think now it's a lot. I feel the moment you say, no, I see things clearly, then you're clearly missing the mark, almost certainly. But I was going to say, I do make more sense. I can make more sense now of the early years, or basically, just what it means to live life as an immigrant, and kind of understanding the complexities of that. And I always felt that my leaving Romania happened rather accidentally. It was never a big plan of going anywhere or doing anything. But as I was hopping around and these opportunities were on the table to travel, to experiencing, I think until I was 19, I had been to maybe Austria or Germany a couple of times, but that was it. And in a kind of very sort of organized structure. But outside of that, I hadn't traveled. It just wasn't a thing that we would do. And, it was complicated anyway. And every time you had to cross the border, it was a pain. It was just difficult. And I was young too, but it wasn't part of my life. So then after you had these opportunities, I always thought I would take jobs in places I had never been. And to me, it was traveling. It was basically, I couldn't have afforded to just take a trip to Japan. So I moved there for work. And similarly with, South Africa and then back to Europe. Like in a way, I had to work in order to assure my existence, or kind of, have an existence. But I would combine it with a part of the world that I'd be interested in. So in a way, I was trying to, I think, catch up to a certain degree, but also it's like the door were open. So I was like, oh my, but there was this, all of that to say that there was at one point this moment where I realized it's very unlikely for me to live in Romania again. And I was thinking, that means I'm not gonna, because you're young in the beginning and you just go and you don't think of life in those terms. But there comes that one moment where you're like, shit, I'm not going to, that means I'm not going to be living close to my parents. so what does it mean then? And you ask yourself all these questions, and they don't really have an answer either. Like, it's weird. It feels right so often with some of those things that, like, you're facing a truth that it's almost like you can not that it kind of feels like you can't do nothing about. It's like a reality that you're confronted with. And so I feel, to me, that the trauma just comes with the hardship of an immigrant life. And it's hard to live in a place where you don't speak your mother language. And it's hard to live in a place where you're just culturally not from, right? None of those things are easy, and they can be fun, and it has actually very little to do almost with the quality of life of the new place versus the old place. I think you're automatically giving something up in the process, like, your closest friendships and parents and relatives, and that sense of a home, of a safety net, of some cultural things that just can't be replaced. I mean, I wonder if it's the same for you, but I think there's certain jokes, certain poems, certain things that can be said in Romanian the way I will never be able, or no one will ever be able to say them in English or German or Spanish or any other language for me.
But it's
And
a real wealth in having that other cultural element of yourself that.
yes, but it's also something that you're getting estranged from because you're not in contact with it, right? So then when you return or when you come back, you're this kind of I think it's just fascinating. So all of that to say that I feel now there is a trauma to the immigrant experience that is just one doesn't have the luxury to acknowledge in the process of, because you're really just trying to carve out a whole new existence, right, from scratch.
Because when you come to a new place that is from your, let's say, home, the terms are kind of clear, right? You are in a new place, there are a new set of rules. And so the terms of engagement are kind of clear, but then maybe when you go back, that's when the trauma happens, because you realize that you don't belong there anymore, which was your home. So then you find yourself between two places, and that might be the traumatic place to be.
I mean, I see for, I mean, sure. Meaning, like,
No, I mean, this is not
there's
a
some laws.
dogmatic theory. It's just a thought.
Yeah, no. It's a point. I do. What I do disagree with is that the rules would be clear when you
Oh,
get to a
okay,
new
of
place,
course, yeah,
because it's all about the invisible rules and the invisible
of
things.
course, yeah.
It took me a long time to understand, and I don't know that I still do, let's say, America, and even just come to terms with what does it mean for me to all of a sudden, to discover that I'm in a big position of privilege in a place like the States. So kind of to just make sense of the country, but also just to understand the culture, the invisible rules, the kind of multitude, like the different dimensions of that. For me, I mean, I lived in many places, but particularly in a place like, let's say, New York or the States, which is extremely diverse and has so many sides to that life. I don't think that's easy. And but I do think also that, again, like, as an immigrant, you're kind of just building life. You don't have the luxury to question, right? Or to kind of like, you can't complain. It's a choice in a way. You're there, you're making the most of it, and you're just happy for the opportunity, right? You can't complain about it in a way, or you can't, you're just building a life.
Because you don't have a history there.
Because you don't have a history, and because you're basically trying to learn to read between the lines and trying to reconcile, you're growing as a person and you're going through life experiences, and where do you draw the line between what's me, what's my cultural background, what's my family experience, like who dictates what's where, right? Like, these boundaries are kind of constantly being readjusted, and I think that's interesting, and that's in a way also the beauty of the immigrant experience. You're learning a lot about yourself in essence, so that's really powerful. But there is something to be said about what you're describing too, with going back and being not unrooted. I haven't lived in Romania again. I think working there is, I find, culturally quite difficult, and that I find a bit sad, because in a way you just want more for that place, and there's opportunities, and then there's there's projects, and there's no excuses at times. But for some reason, there's certain moments in which working with people can just be extremely difficult for no good reason. And that's just sad when you see how opportunities, things on the table are kind of just being thrown away or missed, or not fully kind of taken advantage of. So I think that's been challenging, but I haven't lived there in a long time. And when I visit or when I see people, it doesn't, to me it always does feel like I'm returning to something familiar, and I do take comfort in it.
Of course. Yeah.
But I also haven't, or acknowledged, I think I started feeling rootless, so not having any roots in any place for a long time, and it's something that I came to terms with.
Yeah.
It's fascinating sometimes to, a lot of my friends, whether it's here or even the States, are deeply rooted in those places. And I find it beautiful, and I look at that, and I sometimes think like, what must that be like, for New York to be your home, and to have your history and that is truly where you're from, and that you have your family and your safety nets and everything is there. How must that feel? Or in general, to just have your world be so consistent, such a consistent part of you. And I find that fascinating, but I know it's also something that I don't have anymore. And
in art practices, the identity is quite a central element of a creative product. In architecture, perhaps that isn't the case. And we could, that's a kind of conversation in itself, but the point I'm trying to make is that I kind of had to really, I felt a really strong need to almost like step away from architecture to be able to establish a personal language or a personal way of thinking, approaching problems that I felt was always imposed through architectural education, through architectural practice. Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind, I'm wondering, how did your architectural language evolve, and what did it evolve from? And what is your relationship to that notion of individual expression in a field that, again, I would argue, isn't about the identity? And
it's a tricky one, because I feel there's many sides to it. I think in many ways we can argue that God knows architecture is also too full of identity and too little of, its users.
I know, but just an example I had in one of the earlier talks is that, in the work of Zaha Hadid, for example, she's a female Arab architect, but that's not the subject of her architecture.
But why does it have to be?
Well, I think in art, it might be more imposed.
The one thing that I always sort of, the one thing, I don't know how to best put it, but
I do agree that it doesn't need to be at all. I think that is the value of the work, actually. I personally have an issue with that kind of identity imposition.
But I guess
kind of obvious.
The question or the conversation a little bit clearer or easier for me is if we just kind of, or to break it down,
compartmentalize it.
Like break it in buckets, because when we say architecture, it can mean very many different things to many different people. But there's different roles that we assume in it. So to me, the beauty of Zaha is in the fact that she did what she had a very strong take, and then she stood for it, and she fought for it, and she made it happen. And in a way, that's the most powerful position anyone can be. And to me, she does really represent powerful, and that stubbornness and that identity that has, for me, if it's about, this notion of freedom and expression, and if that's what we're going for, to me, it's crucial. I think the one thing that's always impossible to me is to, I hate being told what to do, or I hate being things being expected of me, and I feel I need to honor that back too. I can't tell other people what to do or expect things from other people to do. So if we're talking about, in essence, wanting a freer, more open world, then I think the point of freedom is to allow Zaha to do whatever she wants as long as she does what she wants. You know what I mean? But less, not pigeonholing everyone into having to reflect whatever our values or our expectations.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And I find that an important part of a lot of the conversations that are happening today, because it's like, oh, but is it feminist or is it not, or is it this or this is not? And it's like, to me, the whole point is someone free to pursue what they're interested in. It's not for us, if you respect someone, it's not for us to dictate what that should be. Like, that crosses a boundary that's always very uncomfortable for me, because I can't stand it when it happens the other way either. But I think there's, what I find, I have a lot of I have a lot of friends in the art world, and I find that I'm learning a lot from them. And what I find most fascinating is that, I mean, the art practice, you have to build up from scratch, right? Like, the idea, you have to establish what you care for, what you're pursuing. Like, you just have to make that up from nothing. Maybe from your skill sets, maybe from your interest, but it's deeply based in who you are, what you care about, right? And in architecture, we're very much trained a little bit like, here's a brief, respond, right? Like, here, bring that newspaper home. A little bit like that. Like, we're trained very much to respond to something. So I feel there's less of that effort or agency to kind of just question, okay, but what do I care about, or what am I trying to stand for? And I'm saying that because I think because of that, quite often we're thinking of, we always have excuses. It's clients, it's power, it's a contractor. There's always someone who's at fault for things. But there's no one or nothing that says that you can't or shouldn't have more of that, like, desire to, whether you call it introspection of, or just kind of having a stronger stance for what you stand for. And to me, that's where the parallel is really, really interesting. And I think there's a lot to be learned of. I mean, as architects, we're just simply also are not artists, and we're trying to respond to different things. So, of course, if you work in a practice and you're 100 people trying to build a tower, practices can also vary wildly. And I think everyone has a take on how they design and how they think of practice. But if you're thinking about something like building a tower, something like that, I mean, that's at the intersection of so many dimensions, from political to social to plumbing and doorknob details, right? Like, there's an incredible spectrum, and that is all about teamwork and understanding one's role within the team, and a concerted effort. It's a little bit like an orchestra, kind of all playing together. And that still means, the orchestra is always only as good as any individual player is, in a way. Like, you depend, each member of the team is crucial, but it's also about how all things come together. I was just talking about the Draft Number 4 book by John McPhee with the students yesterday, and he says something like, the detail in itself is not necessarily relevant, but how all details come together, that's essential. So, when you think of that kind of concerted effort, then I'm not sure where identity falls necessarily into that. I still think each designer, each contributor, each team player has a strong identity which shines in through the work that you're doing. You're also part of something bigger. And that I find also incredibly beautiful in many ways, because it's no easy work, right? And we're dealing with so many parameters and so many rules. It's a bit of a puzzle game, but on steroids, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if that answers
it's an art form in itself. I think the question, I mean, maybe now we can be more specific in this wide question, and that is to ask, how did you find space to develop your language?
Did I develop my language? I think I'm still I'm still working on it, and I hope never to kind of stop working on it, right? Constantly just questioning and asking again and again, just, okay, what is it that I'm trying to do and what are the priorities? I think in the beginning, I remember when I first started learning about architecture, I mean, it was just mind blowing, and it seemed so incredible. And then getting the first job in New York and whatever, it just seemed like, holy shit. Like, it wasn't even like to be able to. It didn't even cross my mind before that would have been a possibility. And then what happens after you work for a few people, you also kind of get tired of working for people, right? Like, in a way, it demystifies itself a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think one has a choice. I don't think there's anything wrong with staying in offices and pursuing really amazing work. And I'm incredibly proud of a lot of my friends who do that. Because again, I think architecture is just really tough. But I know for me, at one point, I was just kind of, if I do something that I'm not truly invested in, I'm going to do a shit job. That's just the reality. Versus if I'm really into something, it can be kind of awesome. So it's always just trying to look for that, how can I contribute best? And a lot of it has to do with trying to understand myself better, and learning to trust myself, learning to trust my own voice, and kind of understanding that, maybe you do have something to offer, or maybe there is a validity to your opinion. I'm saying that because I think so much of architecture education and even professional life can be so much based on the fact it's very top down, right? And it's almost a bullying type of, I have experience, I'm the whatever 60-year-old professor, I have experience, nothing. Like, it's that kind of stuff. And I find that a kind of shit attitude, because you can't hold experience against people. If anything, they can hold lack of experience against you. Because I think, especially today, that is in many ways a true asset, right? Like, having a blank slate and an open mind, and kind of trying to start, like, just not repeating oneself, and not just kind of having fixed ways. And so I always felt that way of yeah, I never quite understood that way. But I think it took me also a long way, because I was a long time, just because I was so excited and into it. And in a way, I think I had to kind of conquer it. I had to get in a place where I was like, okay, cool, I've done this, seen a bunch of places, learned a shit ton, I know what I'm into it and what I'm not, right? And then from there, kind of just trying to take some I don't know, kind of trying to make the most of what the world throws your way. And it's a constant sort of, I don't want to call it struggle, but it's a constant, I think, effort. For me, for me, the key thing, and the thing that I keep returning to, is like, look, I've given up so much in living in many places, and not living close to home, and there's a lot of brutal experiences in all of that. So I feel like, okay, if I've done all this, it better be for something. And in a way, I feel I have a responsibility to be towards me, towards the people in my life, to make sure I do make the most of it. And I'm saying it because I feel I have opportunities that I didn't have 15 years ago, and I didn't even know existed. And I know many people don't have. So if I don't take advantage of these opportunities, or the things that are on the table, if I don't sort of push the gas pedal, if I don't really push for the work, then I don't have anyone to blame, you know what I mean, but me. So I feel, in a way, I have to constantly push myself in an exciting way to find the courage, and to really explore those territories that I'm truly interested in, even though they might not, like, being comfortable doing things that you're always told, not necessarily in an explicit manner, but that might not just be the representation of how architecture is typically seen, or so on and so forth. So kind of, it's a little bit like speaking your mind, when you're being like grown in a way in this world in which there's a very prototypical image of who the architecture is, and how he speaks, and what matters or not, right? But then you look at, I think, a really great exercise is to just watch any lecture by any guy, and ask yourself, okay, if woman A or if whoever was to say these things, would I feel about it differently? And any of us would, self included. And that was really insightful because I was like, okay, well, can I be less brutal to myself then? Can I be just less judgmental to myself? Like, why do I give him so much authority? Can I give
Yeah.
myself some of that authority? Because you also realize, and I mean, if anything Corona showed is that people, nobody has their pants on. There's no adults in the house, right? So everyone's sort of winging it. And once you realize that, you're like, you know what? I'm cool. Like, it's fine. And I see that, I think that gives me also confidence in various circles, because I worked in many places, and in that sense I have more experience than many other people with regards to the inner workings of some of these amazing offices. And there's no two offices who work the same way, right? And so I do remind myself is that, I have experience, I do know something. I just need to trust my own sort of experience. And I think that comes also from trying to think of mentors or people you look up to. To me, it's not about what they did. Did they do A, B, C, D, or did they, whatever? But it's more about, the difference. I feel also as you're getting older, there's always good ideas. There's no shortage of ideas. There's always ideas on the table. The key thing is who makes them happen, or making them happen, or bringing them to fruition. And that means at times just believing hard enough, right? Like, how many ideas go through our days, through our heads day in, day out? If a fraction of those were to become reality, that would be a freaking miracle. So in a way, I got to just admire. I think to me, the thing that stands most out is just about the, let's say, most audacious or interesting projects that I find fascinating. And it's more so that they believed in it enough to push for this
They
thing
persist.
that is seemingly absurd. And so I'm trying to give myself the same sort of confidence or room, because it's not like they had the answer or they knew everything. It's really just kind of believing it and then fighting for it. So that's where I'm at. So I don't know about language, because I feel like I'm kind of more pursuing specific, no, not specific, just things that are on the table or kind of that just distract me.
But then isn't that a case for ongoing transformation as a mode of operating?
Yeah, I do think the one thing that I do want to say though is, there can always be made a sort of revisionist history of telling the story and kind of finding lineages or kind of defining things in a certain way. I can tell you for sure that in my personal, let's say, trajectory, there's a lot more accidents than necessarily intentionality of like a grand plan. And I always wonder, should I make a plan? But then I always think that the things that happen to me across and that happen along the way are a lot more interesting than what I would have dared to plan for. So there is some minor planning happening, of course, but overall, I do think there's a banality to many of the big things that happen in our life, where they come out of a banality of just or like accidents in terms of how they come about or how they happen. And yes, we can always look back and find, having had a certain mindset or being in the place ready for them or ready to make them happen or kind of. But I feel that is an important thing to be taking stock of, and that's just a kind of accidents and the kind of banality that plays a huge role in many of our lives. I mean, look at last year, right? None of this was planned, and we were all just winging it and trying to kind of go through it day by day, week by week, kind of seeing, okay, where's the world now? What can we do now? Right? It's all kind of winging it. So there's a lot.
What do you teach students?
That's a good question. Maybe you should ask them that. I mean, I don't see myself necessarily. I mean, I always the word teacher or professor always like makes me slightly uncomfortable, because I feel I see them as peers, right? And I see them as peers in which we all engage in just interesting conversations. And I think they're exposed to plenty of people with very, very different kind of perspectives and different ways of teaching. But for me, really the main thing that you're trying to get at, and the reason I do really enjoy any of these conversations and the teaching is, I see myself more as an instigator maybe than is really
Curator or something.
Instigator.
No.
Setting fire.
Words are important.
Well, you know, curator implies such a kind of specific kind of this is yes, this is no, and whatever. And I come from a very from a very different perspective. So to me, the most important thing that you want to get get students to discover, to kind of train the muscle, is that of critical thinking. Because once you do the critical thinking, you don't need a teacher, you don't need anyone anymore, right? You can think through your own projects, you can think through your own work. And that has to do, on the one hand, I feel, with them trusting themselves, and therefore like me trusting them so they can get to trust themselves. And then also just kind of, having these peer-to-peer conversations that we look at ideas and we kind of try to learn what they mean, try to understand the consequences of our actions as architects, as designers. You put in up a space with 4 columns, 1 roof, or single column, giant column, 1 roof, or whatever. Just understanding the true consequences of your gestures and or any gestures, just understanding space in many ways, right? And
is there in that a rejection of maybe how you were educated, or a conversation with what you felt education should be and perhaps it wasn't? Or...
Very much so. Because basically, I think I do really appreciate my education. It was, also in Romania, and very pragmatic. And the idea was very much, you're only ever going to get to build brick houses. Therefore, this is how you do a brick house. So in a way, I've experienced exactly that, also because, of course, the previous generations that were teaching us had grown up during communism. So all their hopes were shattered and shattered and shattered and shattered. So there wasn't much left in a way. So by the time we came about, the kind of the same hopelessness was being conveyed to us, and in a way I rejected that, right? And in a way it was someone else's trauma that was being handed down to you, and that's something that I'm very wary of not repeating the same mistake, because that's not how things work. And I understand it can come from a good place, right? They were trying to, in a way, protect us or do what's best for us, quote unquote. But the perspectives are radically different. I think understanding that the kind of generational shift is important. But the other thing that happened too is, it had to do with my first job at Rex in 2006. And I felt, there I was given so much more trust than I was ever given before, and then I would have given myself. I was given responsibility that, I was excited to do anything. So anything they would let me do, I was running with it. But I remember at one point I was a student, and Christopher, who was the project architect, came over, was like, "Juana, do you want to come in this consultant meeting with Arup and tell them where the funicular can go at the Louisville Museum Plaza Tower?" And I was like, "Sure, but someone is going to double check this, please," right? I just couldn't believe it. And, other instances. So I'm eternally grateful to Josh and Eris for that. And Josh was actually just texting now, but I'm always going to be incredibly grateful to them for that air under the wings, in a way. I do feel like that's what kind of allowed me to open the wings and then just say, okay, because if you're an office, or if you're in a creative world, and you want the best of the people that you work with, right? You want their creativity, you want their ideas. The only way you can get that is if you enable them to think, if you trust them to think, if you and enable them to trust themselves to think and explore ideas. I felt even in that world, there were people who were trying to guess what their bosses would want. But you can't think through someone else's head, because then you're dealing with parameters, variables that you can't justify or control. And I think design is very much about the parameters and rules to the game that you set up yourself with. But you can't guess them, or you can't kind of, imagine what someone would want. I don't think that works. So when that happened, and that was a place very, very much flat, we would put things on the table and you would discuss them. and everyone had the same intention, or everyone had the same goal of, we need to make this the most awesome project. So it's teamwork. How do we get there? And I don't want to paint it like it's all easy and all light and everything was great. Of course, egos get bruised and so on and so forth, but you also really learn to put your ego aside and really just invest into that. So I think it opened a whole new universe for me. So then I'm surprised when I don't recognize that in teaching. And when teaching happens from this very different perspective, where you have people tell you, no, this is what architecture is. And that's the one thing that I don't believe in. And not only that I don't believe in, I know for a fact, is that architecture is not a single thing. There's not a single thing of a single way of making buildings, of thinking of buildings, of living in buildings, of anything, of talking about buildings. That's just not the case. And I think that's my primary role, in a way, to show to students that no one can tell you what things are. You need to decide for yourself what things are.
It also addresses the question of parameters, right? Because, I mean, yes, sure, on one side we do need freedom to explore areas of discourse, but at the same time, every freedom is situated in a certain framework. And it's then, how does that framework exist in relationship to the freedom that it kind of has to allow?
I mean, I always think of the way I think I always tend to think of it in these terms. There's things I can control and things I can't. The things that I'm responsible for and things that I'm not. And I'm always looking, this might be my just childhood experience or something. I'm always more interested or focused on what are the things that I can control and what are my responsibilities. Because the things that I can control or are out of my realm, it's like, So what I'm trying to say is, I feel, to me, the key part in this is that freedom comes with responsibility. And that's hard. I think it's not an easy job to assume that freedom, or assume some of the responsibilities that come with, which is that of, holding yourself accountable for the things that you want to do, for the things you want to achieve, and so on and so forth. And making sure you are doing that work in a way, and that there isn't someone to blame or a decoy or something like that. So that's how I'm just overall thinking at this notion of freedom. But even like creatively, right, to assume the let's say creative freedom in making a project, you need to set the parameters, you need to set the rules, and that's not easy. It's a lot easier to respond to a brief and do, oh, this is what I was told to do. It's a lot easier to do that than to kind of think through, okay, what do I think is important in this project? What do I care about? Those are a lot harder questions to ask.
What do you think is the central point of discursivity in architecture? I mean, that word is very broad, but is it a form of practicing? Or is it a form of getting to the projects, the architectural language?
What do you mean with discursivity?
Well, what is the conversation that we should be having? What is there are many, of course, on so many levels, but what area do you think is the most challenged?
I think there's what I see or identify at times is, the super talented, smart, skilled youth or young architects, and they have a hard time reconciling who they are and what they care about with what they're being told architecture is or should be. And in a way, I think to me, in a way, that cut there, getting rid of the myth of the architect or what the profession used to be or what it should be. I think that is an important one, because then you can just be free and use your skill set and apply it to whatever you want in whichever way. I do feel there's a huge burden with that, and it can mean different things. And I think a lot of it has to do also with the myth of the star architect and with the myth of how things work and how things are done, but also with just what our skill sets are. Our skill sets aren't, our biggest skill set isn't making fancy renderings. That's not really, is that really where the value for it lies? So I think in a way, bringing it back to the previous point, I feel, to me, comes back to assuming that responsibility for oneself, of establishing what the values are and then pursuing them, and kind of liberating oneself from some of the baggage that one inherited. So basically what I'm trying to say, I think it's important that the choices one makes are intentional, because there isn't a single prescriptive way of, it's not exactly like medicine or being a doctor. It's there isn't a single prescriptive way of using your skill set, using your education, of being an architect, of practicing architecture, and so on and so forth. So I feel it to me, the key thing is about assuming that responsibility and setting the kind of values for oneself. And I'm saying that because I think, by and large, I feel architecture has been given a bad name in the last years, right? I mean, when I was in school, it was before the 2008 crisis, and they were building the tallest, weirdest, creakiest, whatever, all that stuff in Dubai and China, and now you're like, Jesus, is that's what we were really so into, like that? And that the generation of architects doing that were the generations who were the revolutionaries of the 60s and 70s, who were in the streets in the 60s, you know what I mean? And there was quite a departure from where things had started. And so I think one then has to just, I think there's at times this sense of, oh, my only option is to go work in corporate office, or that's all I can do.
Yeah.
You need to get your hours if you want to get signed off, like, sure, do that. But outside of that, there's many other ways. Basically, I think architecture does need, or could use, just restructuring, rethinking. And at a larger level, I think it to me, what it has to do is kind of just reestablishing its value, both in, I mean, housing is a global crisis, right? Yet it's kind of a side conversation.
Yeah.
Working for cities and defining how our cities are going to live, are going to be, how they're going to be shaped, so on and so forth. These are such crucial conversations, and in a way, it should be celebrated working for the public domain, and it should be celebrated, maybe a little bit more humbleness and maybe less image-driven architecture, but really kind of thinking about materials and sustainability, but in an honest way, in the same way in which, it can't be all about security and comfort and whatever fake countertop one has. But in a way, I feel there's a lot more to architecture than we let it be about in the last, let's say, decade.
And is there also an argument for multidisciplinary approach, or an approach where an education of an architect is not actually at all about building buildings, but giving us a set of skills that can be used, not even in other creative professions, but even sometimes in your bureaucratic professions?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if people if people in other of different background or other professions really beat themselves up as much as we do as architects. That, so often you talk to people, what do you do? It's not really architecture. I'm like, what does it even mean? Like, why do we, like, it's almost like we take the measuring stick always, like, but how tall is your building? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't understand why. Because you basically just have an education which is, I think, really exciting. It has a foot in the past, one in the future. You're kind of a generalist. You tiptoed in many different aspects, and I think our main skill set is really looking at these really complex problems and kind of trusting the process and keeping our cool in facing them, and kind of knowing that, being able to creatively tackle them, that's not for nothing. And what you apply that for, it almost doesn't matter. And I understand that for our parents, the architect is the architect. I understand that they want to see blueprints, but it's up to you to what you choose to apply your skill set towards, and that education towards. And technically, architecture is should be, or is kind of multidisciplinary by default. but I think it also is way too removed currently from many other important disciplines. And I feel that's not a good place to be in 21, right? Because I feel the intersectional, it's almost like the problems that we're facing are kind of building onto each other, but they're all intersecting and they're all overlapping. So I don't think you can separate one things for the other. But in a way, I think the end point is actually not to be prescriptive. I feel it's down to everyone to choose what they want to make. But I've been really enjoying multidisciplinary conversations, currently working with lawyers and people from the Justice Department in the States, and that's been a kind of mind-blowing experience. And I feel in many ways I'm learning a lot more about architecture in dealing with them and talking to non-architects than I do within the profession. So yeah, I think there's a lot of excitement. If anyone would have asked me, would you want to work on Massachusetts court system or something like that, I was like, what does architecture have to do with it? What do I have to offer? But then it also makes me wonder, okay, but why couldn't I have something to offer?
Yeah.
And kind of just seeing, okay, how can, again, it has to do with trusting oneself and kind of just pursuing those conversations and see what you can tell them. But it had, I think on my end, it had to do a lot with letting go of some of that baggage and some of that myth and really just embracing, not having maybe a nice rendering to show and embracing the fact that maybe we don't need to call everything as being or like the myth of the genius sketch or originality or that kind of stuff. Like letting, like it's if you think about it, if you truly think about it, it's absolutely perverse how much of the conversations in school are so much, and outside of school anyway, like don't even get me started on on media or blogs or any of that stuff, are pure. Like it's such a superficial conversation. It's in the media anyway, and blogs and the architecture world, it's extremely superficial. And or when it's not talking to the public, to the wider public. But then within schools, like how much emphasis is being put on the originality, on the new, on the image, on the individual, on that. And it's like, can really everyone be such a mythical figure? Does everyone really need to be a mythical figure? Who is this all for? Like what's the end goal here? So I just think there's maybe ways of looking a little bit different at what we do and what we have to offer. But I think it has to come in a way. What my end point is that it has to do with that individual freedom. We have that responsibility, I feel, almost to question what we've been inherited, what was put on our shoulders, and